Welcome, everyone, to our closing keynote session with Rami and Asar. Time flies when you're having fun, of course. Now, Rami is a speaker, facilitator, and educator who is passionate about the potential of technology to drive meaningful change. He's worked with global organizations, nonprofits, and even several provincial CPA associations. He's an award-winning speaker on the topics of AI and strategic foresight, and it's a pleasure to welcome him to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, it may not seem relevant right now, but I actually want to tell you about my favorite movie, Back to the Future. In fact, anything related to time travel. Absolutely my favorite. I love the idea of being able to go forward and backward in time and being able to kind of understand how things change and evolve. I also want to tell you about one of my favorite books I read. It's actually not really one of my favorite books, but a book I read recently that I really appreciated. It was called Cosmic Perspectives on Civilization, a very big title by the author and educator and astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. Many of you probably know him. In this book, there's one thing that really, really stood out to me. What stuck with me was this idea that every 30 years or so, and I kind of think of that as every generation that goes by, the world becomes unrecognizable. So if we do a quick thought experiment here, it's 2024 still. If we took someone from 1994, 30 years ago, and brought them to the world of today, they'd be lost. They'd be confused why we all have these little 3-inch screens in our hands that we can't seem to ever put down. We take them into the bathrooms with us, and don't pretend you don't. They wouldn't know verbs like Google and TikTok and Instagram, and those have become verbs now. I'm going to Google something. Basically, they'd be lost. The world would be unrecognizable to them. But if we took someone from 1964 and brought them to 1994, we'd see that same pattern hold true. So that's one of the books I want to tell you about. There's another book. Actually, it was 3 books. They came out about 2008-ish. Canadian science fiction author named Robert Sawyer. Not quite as well known as Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he wrote a series of 3 books called the WWW series, Wake, Watch, and Wonder. And I'm going to spoil one of the books for you, but it's 15 years old, and you're probably not going to read it anyway. In the first book, remember, this is 15 years ago, an AI emerges on the internet. And it is a young woman, about 12, 13 years old, who is visually impaired, who is the first person on Earth to discover it. And because she uses her computer with an accessibility device, she's the one who notices that this sentient thing has sort of come to life on the internet. Now, in the second book, the evil Americans get involved, and the NSA and the CIA are trying to shut this thing down. Canadian writer, it's awesome. And she tries to tell her, I guess, friend, companion, whatever you want to call this thing, it needs to tell the world it exists for the good of humanity. So what does it do? Well, it decides to read all the research ever done on cancer. Every clinical trial, every academic study, every journal article ever written. It reads all of them like that, and then it hacks into the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, every newspaper in the world, and the entire world the next day wakes up to the same singular headline: a simple cure for cancer. The idea being, you silly humans, you had already solved this problem. You had just never stepped far away back from all the data you've collected over the last 100 years of research to actually synthesize that information and look at it all at once. If only we had the tools to digest massive amounts of data and understand their meaning all at once. And suddenly, we are living in that world today, right now. And by the way, I am not by any means suggesting that there is a simple, singular cure for cancer or anything like that, but this proposition that says, maybe this maybe it's important to step back from the research because a cancer researcher might be looking at one type of cancer, one type of cell, one type of change in the morphology. That's the world we live in today. So I'm super excited to be here, and what I wanted to do over the next 48 minutes or so is go through a bit of a, again, I'm a time travel nerd, I'm a back to the future nerd. I want to go through a story where we kind of look at the world of AI today, the world of AI that might come true tomorrow, and kind of the world of AI that I hope never ever comes true. So to begin, it's the end of the day. You've all had 2 very busy days. I want you to do some of the work for me to kill some of the time that I need to be on stage. So I'm going to ask you to help me out. So if you can scan this QR code, if you have a smartphone near you, and I'll kind of ramble on here for a few seconds while you all do that. If you don't get to it in time, there's still another way to connect. And if you can't, that's okay. If you just don't want to, I won't be offended. But a couple of times through, we can actually kind of get a pulse of how everyone else in the room is feeling about the topic. On top of that, you can ask questions at any point in time. Then when we get to the end of questions, we'll kind of all come up on the screen as well. So I see lots of emojis. I almost said emoticons, which will give you an idea of my age. Emojis coming up. I see most of you have put your cameras down, unless you're just taking pictures of me. So I'm going to go ahead here. I will introduce myself. My name is Remy. That's not me. I used to have a picture of me on here and I realized that was kind of silly. I'm right here. That's my younger boy. He's awesome. His name's Riley. He's just over 2 years old. I run a small company called 1,000 Days Out. And the name comes from this idea of how do organizations take a longer view of their strategy, of their planning, of their investments, 1,000 days being roughly 3 years. Actually, these days, I tend to encourage organizations to think 5, 10, even 15 years into the future as best they can. I've got a wonderful partner at home and 2 very funny, very different young boys. In a previous life, back when I had a real job, I ran innovation for Mattel. So for a couple of years, my whole world was Barbies and Hot Wheels. My older son had quite literally infinite free Hot Wheels. It was great, except for every time I slipped on them in my house. I teach at a number of different universities in Canada, in the US, and I also teach an AI course, oddly enough, at the Norwegian Technical University every year, and wrote a book called the AI Product Design Handbook. So it's a little bit about me, way more than you really need to know. Now I want to know about you. So I'm going to ask you to, if you still have that window open on your device, and if you don't, you can go to menti.com and put the 8-character code on the screen. And if you're virtually joining, you get to play along too. What I'm going to ask you to do is answer this question. What are the opportunities today, right now in real time, for CPAs to drive impact with AI? So I want you to be thinking about what are the different facets of this technology. I know it's been a hot button topic, not just at this conference, but other events and media that you're probably consuming. And in just a moment, we are going to apply a large language model to your answers to kind of see what some of the themes are so that we can look at one of the actual use cases of AI. So it's working. I see, oh my gosh, 80 plus answers coming in. Oh, it's going really fast. I'm going to give it 30 more seconds. I just noticed cure cancer on there. There's always one person in the room. I've heard all kinds of great things. Okay, we've got 300 answers on here. So we're actually going to run a large language model. If you're not familiar with that term, the Kleenex of large language models, ChatGPT. It is an example of one. So when people talk about when I say ChatGPT, I'm actually usually using it the same way we call facial tissue. Kleenex. It's running right now on your 300-ish answers. Sometimes it gets caught up, usually it works, to look at everything you said and apply this complex algorithm to thousands of words and get it down to some of the core themes. Sometimes just, there we go. So efficiency. 95 of you said something related to efficiency, and you'll see that if I were to click on one of this, it can actually interpret more than just the word efficiency, although many of you just wrote that word. But I see cost savings, make things efficient. I see spelling errors. It still understands, which is pretty great. Automation, financial analysis, data analysis, these are all different aspects of it. So I think there is probably no doubt in the room that this is a once in a lifetime, at least once in a generation transformational technology. So before we dive deep into what that technology will do for us today, you knew I was going to talk more about time travel. We have to go back to 1997. Does anyone remember what happened in 1997? You can just shout it out. Something that happened, come on. This person moved to Calgary. Okay. Anything else significant? I mean, it's hard to compete with, I would say. Well, things that stuck with me. George Clooney was Time Magazine's Man of the Year, and yes, they called it Man of the Year back then. J.K. Rowling published the first Harry Potter book.
Oh, really?
Yeah. 1997. Princess Diana died. Yes, that's true. I don't like to talk about that because it's not a happy thing. But in terms of happy things, Titanic sailed into theaters and into our hearts. All of this happened. But if you ask me, the single most interesting thing to a nerd like me that happened that year was a game of chess between Garry Kasparov, who is pictured on the left, and I actually don't know who that person on the right is, because that person on the right, I'm sure he's lovely. All he was doing was following the instructions that IBM's supercomputer called Deep Blue was telling him to do. And this was the first time in recorded human history that a computer had beat the world's highest ranked, the world's best chess player. And at the time, every headline in the printed newspaper of the day was about the computers are coming, this will change everything, but I'm going to convince you now, or at least try to, that it wasn't that big of a deal. So I play a little bit of chess myself, and when I play chess, usually with my older son, it goes a little something like this. If I do this, he'll do that, I'll do this, he does that, I do this, he might do that. What was my first move again? I can get roughly 3 moves and counter moves in my head before I kind of forget the path. Deep Blue could do 20 billion calculations in the amount of time allocated for one move. That equated to calculating every state of the board 12 moves and counter moves into the future. Deep Blue wasn't AI. Deep Blue was a time machine. Deep Blue could see 24 moves into the future, every possible combination of moves. And then it chose the one with the best positional advantage and took the first step towards that path. And when you think of it that way, it's almost inevitable that humans would lose. Then 20 years goes by, and it takes 20 years for the smartest minds in the world to figure out how to beat, or how to have a computer beat the world's best player of a different game called Go. This is Lee Sedol. In 2017, he was the world's highest ranked player in the game of Go. Go is an immensely complex game with way simpler rules. What makes it so complex? It's a bigger board with more pieces. It's a harder computational problem to solve. How hard? It is estimated that there's 10 to the 170 possible states that the board can be in. It's a 1 with the 170 zeros behind it. For context, there are only 10 to the 80 atoms in the known universe. This is a very, very hard problem to solve. So this is where we came up, or we started leveraging a new type of computation. It's called deep learning. Deep learning is a subset of the AI landscape. And in deep learning, without going super technical about it, we program computers inspired by, or sort of starting to mimic, the way our human biology, the way our human brains work. We have about 86 billion neurons in our brains with trillions of interconnections. That's what inspired how deep learning algorithms work. The other thing that I find really, really interesting about this game of chess, 280 million people in China alone watched this game. There's more than double the number of people that watch the Super Bowl every year. And this was a game of Go. I've watched it. It's not exciting. But from a global kind of Canada productivity, competitiveness perspective, I think it's important to recognize what is happening around the world. And this is one data point pointing us towards a global movement towards these technologies. Okay, let's go 5 more years into the future. We now get to a third game. This is a game that very few of you have probably heard of. It's called Diplomacy. It is a board game played by 7, no more, no less players. And it is described as a combination of Risk, chess, and poker. In Diplomacy, you've got the same goals as in Risk to kind of take over the world, but you cannot do it alone. You have to form alliances with some of the other players. I'm going to play you a short video, maybe.
At Meta AI, we built Cicero, the first AI to achieve human-level performance in the strategy game Diplomacy.
Diplomacy is one of the most intricate strategy games ever created. It's a game about people rather than pieces. The complexity of the game comes from negotiating with other players and trying to work with them to achieve shared goals.
Each turn in a game of Diplomacy takes about 15 minutes where you negotiate with the other players, write down what you want to do, and then everyone reveals what they're doing all at the same time.
Diplomacy presents an enormous challenge for natural language generation. In order to play the game, the AI agent has to converse simultaneously with 6 other players, sending hundreds of messages over the course of a game. The agent has to use natural language to form relationships and build alliances with other players.
There's one more thing they didn't mention. Not only do you have to form alliances to win in Diplomacy, typically you also have to lie. So what they did, because you can play this game online as well, they entered their AI into online tournaments of this game. And after the first tournament alone, Cicero was one of the top 10% of the players in the world. It was able to build relationships with other people who did not know that it was an AI, and at the same time, lie to players. So where we're at now is this progression, right? We had Deep Blue using what we would call brute force, trying every possible combination to beat a person in chess, to Go, where we have something that starts to resemble artificial intelligence and complex reasoning, to Diplomacy, where we bring human language into it, and we start to combine the complex reasoning of these deep learning algorithms with language processing. That's the world we're living in today. It is the world of generative AI. And when I asked an AI about a year ago to make me a picture of Garry Kasparov playing chess against a robot, it made me this. Now, if you look at a picture of Garry Kasparov in his current age, this is a remarkable rendition of him. And yet, you are all CPAs. You're analytical, you're detail-oriented. And many of you are probably wondering whether or not he has 6 fingers on his right hand in real life. He does not. We would call this a mistake. We would call this an error. In AI terms, sometimes we call it a hallucination. The algorithms are not perfect. If I can encourage you or have you remember one thing today, and just one thing, at least from my part of the day, it would be a mistake to say, look, there's mistakes in this image. We could never use tools like this. Because 18 months ago, 2 years ago, this was not possible. The idea of taking a natural language piece of text and rendering a near photo-ish image. By the way, when I sent that piece of text to it, it understood who Garry Kasparov is, understood what a robot was, it understood what chess was. There's so much understanding there. 2 years ago, we could not do that. So rather than thinking about the weak points of AI today, we have to use our kind of foresight mindset and our 1,000 days out thinking to say, what might it do for us in a year or 2 or 3 from now? So on that note, a couple of things, and really focused on the world of CPAs that I think are happening right now in the world of AI. The first one is we are seeing the really rapid, faster than anyone had predicted even, democratization and improved accessibility of large language models. So ChatGPT is an example of a large language model. Claude, Copilot, Gemini, they all have silly names now. They're popping up everywhere. They are popping up in chat interfaces, but they are also popping up directly integrated in the tools we use. LinkedIn, Microsoft Outlook, Teams, all of them have some version of these capabilities starting to be built in. This is an important one, and there was a big milestone that happened actually earlier this week on this front, Edge AI. And it's going to sound a little bit technical for a second, but there's a reason I want to share it with you. Edge computing and Edge AI in particular is this idea of what happens when we can run the algorithm, do the computational processing for AI on the device that is, quote, at the edge of the network. The edge of the network is your smartphone, your laptop, maybe even the server in your office. What happens when we don't have to run these algorithms in the cloud? Well, all of a sudden, one of the biggest security concerns, which is transmission of sensitive or private information, in your case, maybe even financial data, goes away, because that data never has to leave the edge device. So whereas you've probably already been warned, and many of you, and many from your employers even, to say, be really cautious in terms of what information you might put into one of these large language models, one of these chat tools, as we move towards a world of Edge AI, the risk associated with that goes down. I said something big happened this week. Apple announced their Apple Intelligence, which annoyingly also is an acronym for AI, on their latest iPhones. But the big thing about it is that the work it's doing is being run on the device. So your personal information, in theory, is only staying on the device versus being sent to the cloud to private companies. The third one, I think this is probably at kind of that strategic level what's going to be most important to the people in this room, is that it is changing the nature of your work. And I would say this applies to anyone working in professional services, accounting, legal, consulting. By having tools literally in your pocket that can do some of the more menial, redundant, task-based work, you at least should be freed up to bring a more strategic lens, to actually work hand in hand with the technology to elevate your value proposition with your clients, within your organization, within your stakeholders. It's a massive opportunity to shift towards more strategic work. And finally, I don't think we can talk about this without talking about some of the risks, and I'll elaborate on those in a bit. But earlier this year, for the first time in Canada at least, an organization was held accountable for what its AI did. On February 24th of this year, Air Canada lost a judgment in a tribunal in BC. It had to repay a customer $888.42. Not a ton of money. They spent months in court, which probably cost a lot more than $888, but they argued, this is true, that they were not accountable because the AI was a separate legal entity from Air Canada and they weren't responsible for what it told their customer. This was a chatbot on their website. The argument didn't hold up. We're all giggling, but they argued this. A bunch of high-paid lawyers made that argument. They lost that. They had to repay this gentleman $888.42. But it also set a precedent that says you cannot disconnect yourself. You cannot claim to not know what it's doing. And one of the biggest opportunities, but at the same time, one of the biggest risks with AI is that it is what we might call non-deterministic computing. The same input into the same algorithm twice in a row might not generate the same output. We don't always know what it's going to do. And that's a scary, scary thought if you think about that, because what computers for the last 50, 70 years have always done is been predictable. Information goes in, information or analysis comes out, but it would be the same every time. All of a sudden, it's not following that pattern. So, as we switch our thinking a little bit from the world of AI now, I think it's actually a lot more fun to think about where it's headed, but I want to talk about a couple of things that are on the near term, kind of 3 to 5 year horizon. But before we get to those, what is causing this shift, this sort of AI next shift? If you ask me, one of the biggest things that is happening in real time right now is the availability of either low-code or no-code tools. What I mean by that is building proofs of concept or even building AI solutions without writing a line of code. And the single wildest example I've heard of that is a company in the US, the consumer packaged goods company. They're not very big. They make frozen pizzas. And they have had one issue ongoing for many years. Sometimes the pizzas don't have evenly distributed cheese. That's a bad pizza. They had an intern propose an idea of using AI to analyze the pizzas for cheese distribution. The person was shut down, told, no, it's a waste of resources. That's a really complicated solution. We just have someone on the line who can look at the pizzas. This intern ignored their boss's suggestion. They went to Best Buy. They bought a $30 Logitech webcam, connected to their laptop, and in under 2 days built an algorithm that was able to identify these pizzas. The reason I share that kind of goofy example with you is that 5, even 3 years ago, it would have been insane to propose using AI for such a narrow, kind of long tail use case. But we live in a world now where these use cases are actually starting to make financial sense. So what are some of those ones that I think are relevant to CPAs? Well, there's one that I've actually worked on myself, so I'll share a little bit about that. But I worked on a project looking at automating and improving audit processes and the risk assessment that goes along with it. I was fascinated by the project, for one thing, because it's so much harder than I thought it was. Audit was a really interesting space because it was meant understanding the information in both text and typically table formats, financial data, interpreting that information, comparing it against other sets of standards and different reporting guidelines. Ultimately, what I learned was we are looking for needles in haystacks over and over and over again. But the cool thing about AI is it's really, really good at finding anomalies. It's actually one of the things algorithms do arguably better than humans. Finding that needle in the haystack. What was really remarkable to me about this project was it didn't just drive the automatic metrics you're thinking of. Sure, this would save time, this would mean fewer manual processes, maybe a reduction in error. But as the system evolved, we also recognized audit didn't have to be a one-time thing anymore. And that led to some work that we did, and we're not the only ones who have done this, around continuous audit. That as more data came in and more records came in, it was basically running audit processes 24/7 and identifying through predictive analytics and complex modeling, fraud, identifying anomalies in the data, identifying gaps in the data where information was missing on an ongoing basis. It was basically acting as an agent that was working 168 hours a week looking at all this data. Other areas are using advanced business or predictive analytics for business performance, and being able to source information from a much, much richer set of data sources in terms of understanding where a business may be going. And I think that's a big part of what will help CPAs elevate their role or continue to elevate their role into that more strategic level. And then one that I recently read a white paper on was looking at AI-enhanced M&A work, where the algorithms were able to identify risks in target acquisition companies that people just would have overlooked or did overlook. And this, again, this sort of layer on top of human intelligence that it was able to provide. And it was a really, really interesting study on where it could be involved in M&A. So what might the next 5 years look like? And I don't have a crystal ball. I cannot predict the future, but we can look at where the trends are taking us. When we talk about the term future of work, I actually hate that term because typically what we're referring to is work from home versus work in the office. But I don't think we fully understood how much the way we work will change, how we will work hand in hand with these technologies. Software developers already now are using AI to write immense amounts of code. And the transformation in that industry is measured in orders of magnitude, where developers are doing 10, even 100-fold productivity improvements because they describe what the tool should do and the code is generated for them. We're going to see shifts like that in almost every industry. At the same time, we're going to see more serious threats from more bad actors from more parts of the world. Cybersecurity and everything that goes along with it will become a bigger and bigger concern. And every once in a while, the world gets a little, like kind of a, if you remember in school fire drills, we get a little fire drill. And just a few months ago, I think the world failed on its fire drill when there was that one Microsoft Outlook CrowdStrike issue, and no one really knew what to do about it. We're going to see more of this, and that's the counter side to all this exciting innovation. And if we look even beyond 5 years, we're going to start seeing other waves of technology. In particular, we're going to see quantum computing, neuromorphic computing, and synthetic biology all advancing at the same time. Author and the founder of DeepMind, Mustafa Suleyman, calls this the coming wave. When these 3 or 4 transformational technologies all kind of hit us at once over the next 5-10 years. It's an exciting time to be alive, and also absolutely terrifying. So as we think about how fast technology changes, I'm always reminded of the words of Edward O. Wilson. He's a biologist in 2009, said, "We have Paleolithic minds, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies." And if you think about that for a second, he could not be more accurate. Our technologies are evolving at a pace that we literally can't keep up with. And yet our organizational frameworks, our legislative and regulatory frameworks are very slow to adapt. And our brains just weren't wired for this. So with that, we have to explicitly spend time thinking about the guardrails we need to put up, whether we call that ethical AI or responsible AI, it doesn't really matter. But I want to illustrate to you one slightly uncomfortable, but I think very important example of what happens when this goes wrong. In this image you're looking at, there are 2 infrared thermometers. These became very popular during COVID. You would go into a restaurant, if you could go in, and they would check your temperature to figure out if you had COVID or not. We learned pretty quickly it was a very bad way to measure if someone might have COVID, but we used them anyway. A group of researchers put these 2 images of 2 different infrared thermometers into Google's image labeling algorithm, which is looking at what are the objects in this image, can we identify them? And the one on the right was identified as a piece of technology, an electronic device, maybe a camera, maybe a phone, whereas the one on the left was clearly a gun. Now, there are many of you who like to play devil's advocate, and you're going to say, Rami, wait a second. The one on the left is dark green and black. It definitely looks more like a gun than the white one. And you are right, it does. Researchers thought of that too. So they used what I can only assume is Microsoft Paint to reshade the skin tone in the image on the left. And as you can see, Google was no longer threatened by it. The same device in one hand versus another hand was labeled differently. Bless you. Context matters. These tools can't necessarily separate these things. So we have to think critically about when we use these technologies, is there potential for harm? That harm can come from the reflection or amplification of bias for example, which this would be, like I said, a slightly uncomfortable, but I think a very powerful example of. At least for now, in the words of Fei-Fei Li, AI doesn't have a conscience, and we do, and it's our job to ensure that we develop it responsibly, to develop it ethically, and avoid reinforcing the biases that exist in data, the biases that exist in all of us. So how do we actually do that? What I wanted to do was actually show a couple examples of risks that I think are a little bit more specific to your industry, and then introduce sort of this AI impact framework, which I'll do kind of a high-level overview of, and then point you to where you can grab the whole framework if you so choose. So I would say data privacy and security breaches should be top of mind for you. The better our ability to use data to do complex analysis, forecasting, audit, automated tax preparation, whatever it happens to be, the more data we need. The more data we need, the more data we store. The more data we store, the more at risk we are when, not if, when there's a data breach. And while we can put up all the barriers and security protocols we can dream of to try to avoid such breaches, such incidents, I think it's important for leaders to say, what happens when this occurs? Because that changes the mindset and it changes the conversation. The second one is compliance. Right now, we're pretty lucky in Canada because it's kind of wild, wild west. We don't actually have very strong, if any, regulations around AI. However, as of August 1st of this year, so last month, the EU AI kind of took effect. I say kind of took effect because it was rolled out, but it's being rolled out over 6 months. The EU AI Act is certainly, on a global scale, the most comprehensive and most stringent set of regulations around AI and set of punitive measures, aka fines, upwards of 6% of a company's gross revenue or upwards of 35 million euros per incident. What I would suggest for an organization who's trying to think, well, what happens when Canada will build its own set of regulations? It is a very good and common practice to look at what's happening in the EU, typically in terms of, we saw the same with GDPR and then later on with CASL in Canada. We tend to mirror what happens in other parts of the world, not in a good or bad way, it's just the way it goes. So I would recommend things like the EU AI Act is a very good source of information about where regulation might go. And one of the really, really big things that it has done, in my opinion, very well, is that we need to regulate different AI systems differently, which means we need a risk-based approach, which is something that I think to accountants should resonate with you. High-risk AI systems need one level of oversight. Low-risk AI systems need other levels of oversight. What are examples? Well, a high-risk AI system would probably be anything where you are using financial data, either internal or client data, to do any kind of modeling on, or make any sort of conclusions from, or forecasts from. What's an example of low risk? I'd say if you work in the marketing part of your organization and you are using it to proofread copy for your website or even generate copy for a website. Differentiating different risk levels will help organizations better comply with whatever regulations do come in, but it is going to be a set of moving targets for the next number of years as we go forward. The third one, what happens to jobs? I get asked the question all the time. There's lots of great cliche answers. Will AI take my job? The really popular, again, cliche answer is no, but someone who knows how to use it will. And if you think about it, it's true. When I first heard that expression, I was actually on stage with the CEO of a company, and she answered a question from her employee about it. And out of curiosity, I actually looked up. I had a suspicion. I found my 1997 high school resume. Applied for a job at Staples. It was only one page, and under special skills in like size 28 font, because you got to fill the page. And student council only takes up so much room. But under special skills, I listed familiarity with Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel. In 1997, that was a differentiating skill. If you got a resume from someone applying to work for you and they listed that they know how to use Microsoft Excel, you probably wouldn't read much past it. Then it's an assumed skill. I think working with AI will very quickly become an assumed skill. This will impact jobs. I think there's no doubt that it will. And I actually think we wouldn't be investing globally literally trillions of dollars into this technology if there weren't significant cost savings. Those tend to come from human costs. So it's an important thing to think about. So let's put this all together. This is something that my team and I kind of worked on for one client, and we've sort of just published it ourselves. A bit of a framework for taking a holistic approach to bringing AI into an organization. There's sort of 5 pieces of it. The first is, and this comes from my work in strategic foresight, you have to take a longer-term outlook. You can't look at that picture of Gary Kasparov and say, no, this technology is not ready yet. Because it's going to take you a while to onboard it and bring it into your organization anyway. So you have to look at, to borrow again, a slightly overused analogy, where the puck is going. What is the future of technology telling us here? And we need to think about it through all the lenses: auditing, tax preparation, advisory, from sort of a 2030, even a 2035 mindset. The second one, you have to measure things. And you have to decide what you're going to measure early. One of the biggest mistakes I see organizations make is they invest into proofs of concept for new AI applications, or they work the vendor, build a solution, onboard it, and then afterwards say, is this having impact for us? Well, at that point, first of all, you've already made the investment, so it would be a bad decision to say, no, it's not. So setting out what those metrics are, what those KPIs or any other measurement framework are in advance. We want to save time. We want to improve accuracy. We want to improve efficiency. Even if it is, we want to cut jobs. We want to reduce headcount. Not advocating for that, but if that's your goal, set that out as part of your measurement framework so that as you make these investments, you can quantify the impact. The third one, which we just talked about, is organizations need to define their own sets of guidelines or guardrails on how they will use these technologies. This means thinking about the impact to people within the organization. It thinks about the role of bias amplification or reflection, all the different aspects of working responsibly with every type of technology, but in particular AI. This matters so much more than any other technology we've worked with before because of that non-deterministic quality, because of the fact that we don't always know what it will do. I think closely related to that is sort of a human-centric approach. And while I know it might be slightly glasses half full, optimistic to say, I really hope that AI initiatives don't start with how do we reduce headcount, but it's actually saying how can we make people work better, how can we make them like their work more, how can we make them more efficient, maybe how can we finally give everyone 4-day work weeks like we've been talking about for the last couple of decades, really. How might technology enable rather than replace people? The last one, I'm going to make you do this one. I'm curious, so you can grab your phone. If you've closed that window, it's okay. You can go to menti.com and then we'll switch to some Q&A for the last 10 minutes here. I have my answer for this question. I want to know what are the skills and competencies that CPAs need to foster and develop both in yourselves and in your people to drive positive outcomes with AI. Let's see if anyone gets the right answer. The first one that came up was the right answer. By the way, I'm just joking. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's certainly my favorite word. Curiosity, open-mindedness, adaptability. I love this. So as you share some of your thoughts here and you get to see what your peers are thinking about, curiosity, this willingness to ask questions, this need to ask questions is so fascinating to me. A group of researchers out of Harvard in 2014 actually studied curiosity. They looked at something they called CQ. So you have your IQ, your intellect quotient, your EQ, your emotional intelligence, and your CQ, your curiosity quotient. At what age do you think we humans have the highest curiosity quotient? 15? 2, 4, 3? It's right around the age of 5. By the way, no one shouted out like 52. It's around the age of 5. Our peak curiosity is around the age of 5. What else happens around the age of 5? Right, we start school. And I don't need to go into a commentary about our education system, that's not the goal here. But there's a correlation there. The cool thing about curiosity, though, is they've actually shown that unlike your IQ, you can train it. You can actually improve your curiosity. There are exercises, there's puzzles, there's things you can do to make yourself more curious, but also to foster curiosity in the people you work with. The other wildly interesting and kind of scary thing that they discovered in this research was people with a high CQ were more likely to succeed in their careers. Now, they measured career success through promotions and through an organization. I'm an entrepreneur. I certainly don't think that's the only way to measure it, but it is a measure. People with a high CQ were more likely to have success in their career than those with a high IQ alone. If you take it to its logical extreme, it means the person who's willing to ask the question is more likely to be successful than the one who knows the answer. Curiosity drives innovation, and it drives everything to do with getting value out of tools like AI. So with that, I'm going to leave this up for a second here while we transition. You don't have to, just if anyone wants that framework, but with a whole lot more information specific to CPAs, you can grab it. It's not promotional, it's just a 2-page PDF that you're welcome to grab. I want to go full circle to where we started. We talked about the nature of time and about my love of Back to the Future and Marty and time travel and DeLoreans. But we can go back even further than 1997. I actually want to go back with you about 200 years to Japan at the time of an artist named Hokusai who painted this. This is sometimes considered the second most recognizable painting after the Mona Lisa in the world. It's usually referred to as the Great Wave. It's actually not technically the name of the painting, but we'll call it the Great Wave. And in the 1830s, when Hokusai painted this painting, it was revolutionary, not just because of the painting itself and the fact that it inspired the likes of Van Gogh. If you look at this, you can actually almost see the swirls of Starry Night in the waves. But it was revolutionary because he used a block printing process that had never been used in Asia before that allowed him to replicate this painting. And one of the reasons this became such a popular painting is because they were able to replicate it faster than any other painting before. The state of emerging technology 200 years ago for Hokusai was little blocks that he dipped in paint. We can go back even further. 100,000 years ago, ancient versions of us were walking around plains of Africa, picking up sticks and hitting trees to knock fruit out of the tree. That was emerging technology 100,000, 200,000 years ago. We have always used technology to take what is in our imagination and make it real. We have used technology to overcome our physical limitations for as long as we've been walking upright. The reason I am excited and not terrified to be alive today, at least most days, is because we are at a moment in time where we are now using technology not just to overcome physical limitations, but overcome our intellectual limitations. Where we're able to imagine solutions and create them almost instantaneously. It is a wildly interesting time to be alive, and I hope that you all go back into your organizations thinking about how you can drive innovation, how you can drive better outcomes for your clients, for your stakeholders, for your companies, with technology as a partner. And maybe this will be a good moment here to take some questions. So this is the scary part, because if no one submitted questions, it's a blank slide that comes up. Oh, 15 questions. Oh, we're rocking 15, it. We're not going to have time.
Wow, all right. So first things first. When you speak about risk as it relates to data privacy, can you elaborate more on that? in the context of automation, personalization, and other ways to use AI?
Sure. I think it's all based on the relationship of to get the outcome. Everything in AI is based on massive amounts of data. So to get more benefit from it, we need more data in, which means we are collecting more information. So one of the best practices that organizations will do will be to, as much as possible, anonymize data when they can, so that if there's a breach of these massive amounts of data, it may not be personally identifiable. But as you collect more data, as you use more AI, you are increasing your risk profile for sure.